Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. Jill here, and I have to say, I am just back from my professional meeting called the Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo, and it was absolutely wonderful. I had so much fun meeting new people who listen to this podcast, follow the blog on thenourishchild.com. And so that was just a real charge for me to be able to meet some new folks who are aware of my work, and I got to connect faces with names. I also got to see a lot of old friends. It's a meeting that brings us all together. Many of us work all over the country and with different populations, and it's so nice to be able to come to a conference and get together and see each other in real time. I also got to give away several copies of my new book, Kids Thrive at Every Size. Big thanks to Orgain, who made that possible. And I spoke about teen nutrition with Dr. Leslie Kaplan and Dr. Heather Leidy. Heather has been on the Nourish Child podcast before in the past. So it was a lot of fun to present teen nutrition, present the research on nutrition, which, as she pointed it out in her part of the presentation, that only 1.5% of randomized controlled trials are conducted in children and teens. So we don't have a lot of research on teenagers, but she did a great job of presenting the nutrition findings in this population, and we'll probably do a little bit more talking about that later on in the show down the road here, but really fascinating stuff. I had the pleasure of presenting sort of the practical, how you interact with teens and how you can motivate them to eat better and how you can connect with them. So it was just a really great meeting. Today on the show, though, I have Dr. Reshma Shah, who is a board-certified pediatrician, award-winning author of the book called Nourish, the Definitive Plant-Based Nutrition Guide for Families. She's a parent herself of 2 young adults and has over 20 years of clinical experience, most recently as an affiliate clinical instructor at Stanford University School of Medicine out in California. She now focuses on supporting families through parent coaching. And today we are talking about teens who are practicing vegetarianism and what you as a parent or a professional who is working with them need to know and pay attention to. So with that, I am going to hand this over to you all. And here is Dr. Reshma. Dr. Reshma Shah, welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast. I'm so glad you're here today to talk about teens and vegetarianism. Before we get started, why don't you let our listeners know who you are and the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, Jill, thanks so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be with you. I'm a pediatrician, and I practiced for over 20 years as a general pediatrician. And I would say about halfway through my career, I became really interested in nutrition and the role that it played in children's health. And so for the last decade, a lot of my work is focused around that. And I wrote a book on plant-based nutrition for families and have been working on creating courses and making this information more available to parents and health professionals.
Awesome. And you're a mom, right? And and your children, I think, maybe are grown like mine are, or maybe a little bit younger than mine.
They're grownish. I say they're adultish.
Yes, I like that phrase too. It seems so apropos. So tell me about your work in the past with teenagers who might be vegetarian and what you've seen as a pediatrician over the years, and maybe even some of the trends that you've noticed in that arena.
Yeah. And it's kind of surprising because I think one of the intersections in which I've seen this come, both clinically and also, through the speaking and the other work that I've done, is oftentimes it's parents coming to me saying, I'm very worried that my child wants to be a vegetarian. Can you please help me convince them not to do so? So that's probably one of the most common things. It's a lot of parental anxiety. So that's one situation. And then I would say the other situation is parents who, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll talk about, have become more interested in, not necessarily even becoming vegetarian or vegan, but moving more towards a plant-based diet and wanting support and guidance on how to do that successfully. And then I would say, sort of in my own household and amongst my colleagues, I think a third way that it comes up is wanting to create some independence and ownership around eating in a nutritious, healthy, and enjoyable way, especially as they transition out of being in our homes as adolescents and into young adulthood. So I would say those are the sort of three main areas that these sorts of questions are coming to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious, do I obviously, we all know there's been a more plant-based forward or plant forward movement. Let's just, in your mind, what does it mean to be plant-based versus vegetarian versus vegan?
Yeah.
Are they all the same, or are there subtle differences?
And I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think it's a really good way to sort of frame the entire conversation. I don't have a problem myself saying that I follow a plant-based diet or a vegan diet, because those things both seem to fit for me. And what I encourage people to do is to use these terms and these definitions in ways that feel supportive for their efforts. And so I think that plant-based is the sort of biggest umbrella term, because it's probably the most sort of restrictive in some ways. In my mind, plant-based means that you are looking to get the vast majority of your caloric intake from plant-based foods, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're eliminating all animal-based foods in the diet. And I find that most people that talk about eating a plant-based diet, generally speaking, it's because of health concerns or for environmental reasons. A vegan diet is something that's going to exclude all animal foods. And I find that for most people, and again, it's a generalization, that comes more from if you're operating from a place of animal welfare or wanting to mitigate animal suffering. And so people that eat a vegan diet, there's going to be no animal foods in the diet whatsoever. And a plant-based diet, I think there's a little bit more flexibility. And then there can obviously also be variability in terms of the nutritional quality of the foods that you eat in both of those diets. I think when I think about plant-based, I think about really focusing most of your diet on whole plant foods like beans and whole grains and fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. I think there's room for all kinds of foods in our diet. And I know you and I have a very similar approach. But you do have to be a little bit careful, because sometimes these terms don't completely translate. So a vegan diet, you could be eating, chips and, donuts and pastries and things. All those things can be vegan, but they're not necessarily going to be health promoting if they're consumed in large quantities in the diet. So I think use the terms that feel most like they're going to be supportive of your efforts. I think saying that you want the vegan option is very clear to the person if you're going out to eat or if you're at a friend's house. So plant-based is sort of more of an umbrella term, and then vegan is a little bit more specific in terms of excluding all animal foods in the diet.
And vegetarian can be more specific in that you're allowing or consuming certain types of animal foods in the diet and not others.
Right. So it's typically eggs and dairy, but it's funny because I've seen people saying, oh, I'm a vegetarian, but I eat chicken. That's not quite what we think about with vegetarian diets, but yeah.
Yeah. Or fish.
Or fish.
Pescatarian. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so it's interesting to me that parents might be coming to you and concerned about their teenager wanting to be plant-based or vegetarian or even vegan. Sort of walk me through what that conversation is like between you and that parent who has those concerns.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I want to know is, tell me what you're concerned about. And oftentimes it's some combination of, I'm afraid that they're not going to get the nutrients that they need. How are they going to get enough protein? How are they going to get, name the nutrient? So that's usually one of the main concerns. And then I think, especially in adolescence, for a lot of parents, it's sort of creates a red flag of, is this a sign that I need to be worried that they're becoming more restrictive in their diet? Do I have to be worried about, this turning into an eating disorder? Is that what this is about? So those are probably the two most common questions. And I think for either one of those questions, my response is always, specifically tell me about your concern. And then let's talk to your teenager. Let's talk to your kid and ask them, tell me more about this. And so a lot of times I think that parents in particular, move in with a lot of anxiety and a lot of worry instead of just saying, tell me more about it. And that's a good starting point.
Yeah. And when you talk with teens, like I remember when I was doing face-to-face private practice back, in my days in Nashville, I would have teens that would come in and say, I want to be vegetarian. Vegan and plant-based weren't really the words that we were using during those, 12, 15 years ago. So these teenagers would come in and they would say, I want to be vegetarian. And I would ask them what that meant to them.
Yeah.
Right. What does that mean for you? Yeah. And so it was like, well, I don't like beans and I don't like tofu, but I could have cheese pizza and macaroni and cheese, and I never eat vegetables. And it would be like sort of this, well, this is really, an interesting frame up for what you think a healthy vegetarian diet would be like.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if that's, when you're actually talking with the teens, is that what you're seeing now as well? Or is it a different framing?
Yeah. Well, I think that people are sort of, for the good or the bad, because of social media and all the other things that we're exposed to, I think that people's awareness around nutritional needs and things are definitely increasing. And so I find that it's not often that they're saying, I want a cheese pizza and, not liking vegetables kind of a diet. And I think that it's really important when we talk about these conversations around meeting nutrient requirements and things like that, that we're really including kids in an age appropriate way. Because that's fantastic. You want to be a vegetarian. Tell me more about it. And then really work together and collaborate to make sure that you're meeting your nutritional needs for your growing child. And I think as a parent, sometimes one of the things I've been leaning into, even with my young adult kids, is being sort of a little bit more direct and upfront with my concerns. I'm really excited to support you. I'm just nervous you're not going to get enough protein, or how are we going to get you to meet your iron needs? And then you're sort of engaging your child in the problem solving rather than telling them you can't do this because you're not going to get enough protein or whatever the worry might be.
Yeah. Yeah. And supporting them along that journey in ways that allows them to have the freedom to experiment, right? Because I think that, I don't know what your sense is. I remember my own children coming to me and saying, I don't want to eat red meat anymore. I want to take that off the plate. Okay, let's do that. What are we going to have instead? Having that conversation and problem solving together. I'm curious though, when you engage with clients, with your teenagers and your parents, what is their awareness of the nutrient needs? When they say, I'm worried about meeting nutrient needs, what's their level of awareness around which nutrients are at risk versus which nutrients are not really anything we need to worry about?
So I would say the number one thing is usually protein, because, that's sort of what we're all sort of obsessed with these days. And I find that most people, if they're exploring vegan and vegetarian diets, they know a little bit at least about B12. So I think those are probably the two that get the most attention. And I think for the most part, I would say, I think that people understand that B12 is a critical nutrient, that if you're going to be eating a vegan diet, and actually studies suggest even a vegetarian diet, that you should be making sure that you have a reliable, consistent source of vitamin B12. Those are the ones I think that get the top attention, but there's so many other nutrients that we have to take into consideration. And the other thing that I think it's important to sort of remember in this whole conversation is when you look at the healthy index eating scores for adolescents across the board have the lowest healthy eating index score of any age group. It's, I think, like 51, so almost close to out of 100. And so I think it's important to put it into context. It's not just the nutrition of vegan and vegetarian adolescents that we need to be focusing on, but really all adolescents, because there could be a lot of improvement in their healthy eating index scores overall. In general, research actually suggests that vegan and vegetarian children have a higher intake of foods that are thought to be health promoting. So in some studies, they've shown that the vegan groups, those kids are the only ones that actually meet the recommended intake of fiber. So I think it's really important to balance, like, yes, we may be concerned about these nutrients, but vegan and vegetarian children tend to do much better with this set of nutrients. So putting that in perspective.
Yeah. So as we sort of hone in on the teenager, what are the nutrients that sort of you're curious about, you're going to be a little bit more sensitive to?
Yeah. I think the first one is actually just overall energy intake, because sometimes especially if they are moving towards a more, healthful plant-based diet where they're eating lots more fruits and vegetables and whole grains and things like that, I think it's really important to make sure that they're still meeting their energy requirements, especially if you're dealing with a teenager that's an athlete, that's very active. So one of the things, people say, I don't have as much energy or whatever, it's because they're not eating enough calories. So I want to make sure that they're getting adequate calories. And then I think protein is one of those things that we do have to pay attention to, because to your point, if your diet is, cheese, pizza, and,
Pasta
and things like that, you may not be meeting your protein requirements. So I like to make sure that the protein requirements are there. We talked a little bit about B12. I find that for kids in general, the easiest way is just to take a B12 supplement, because we know, especially young kids and even adolescents, their intake of fortified foods, it can vary dramatically. And so if they're not consistently getting a couple of servings of fortified foods a day, they may be falling short. So it's an easy supplement to take with, low risk of side effects, and it's fairly inexpensive. So for me, that's sort of a non-negotiable. You want to make sure that they're getting a source of B12. But then there's some nutrients that we may not be paying as close enough attention to that I think are really important, especially for teenagers. The most notable being calcium. The main source of calcium in omnivorous diets tends to be dairy. And if you're vegan, you're not consuming dairy. So you want to make sure you're getting adequate calcium intake. I've heard a lot of people in the plant-based vegan community saying, well, you just need to eat calcium foods. And kale and other foods are great sources of calcium, but I think it would be really difficult for most children and even adolescents to get enough calcium from food sources alone. So I typically recommend a calcium fortified plant-based milk if they're going to be eliminating dairy in the diet. In my previous work when I was in Cleveland, large majority of the patients I followed, they weren't vegan, but they didn't consume they didn't consume dairy because of lactose intolerance or other issues. So I always remind people calcium is not just a nutrient of concern for vegan children, but also for omnivorous children who don't consume dairy. And I think increasingly more and more people are sort of limiting dairy in the diet. So the other trend that I've sort of seen is that people want to eat or consume clean ingredients. So, having a plant-based milk that only has one or two ingredients. But for calcium and a variety of other nutrients, I think fortification is the way to go. So if you have a couple of glasses of fortified plant-based milk and some calcium-containing foods, most teens can meet their calcium intakes. So we talked about protein, B12, calcium. Do you want me to just keep going? Or I don't know if you want to.
Well, I was just going to chime in on calcium. The other, and I don't know, I'd love to hear, feedback on this as well. But even, calcium in broccoli and sesame seeds, and there are other inhibitors in those food products like oxalates and phytates that make the absorption a little bit more challenging. So, it is important to pay attention to calcium. Yes, you can get it from other foods, but you really do want to pay attention to the nutrient, because it's kind of like vitamin D for all children. And I'm sure you'll want to talk about vitamin D, but yes, it's out there. You really have to put thought into it, whether you're plant-based or an omnivore, to make sure you get enough, because we wear sunscreen. We live in the northern part of geography or of the country. Vitamin D foods are few and far between, quite frankly. Yeah. And even when they're fortified. So I feel like for the vegetarian or vegan or plant-based teen, that calcium is like that nutrient that you really do want to be like, where am I getting it from? And am I getting a few sources every single day to make sure I'm covered?
Yeah. And I think calcium is definitely a nutrient of concern, even in the dietary guidelines from the most recent ones. And so I think for all teenagers, and especially for vegan children, The vitamin D is, again, it's one of those nutrients that I think for a lot of kids, it's very difficult to get without consuming. And even with fortified food, the amount of milk that a child would have to consume, even if it's cow's milk that's fortified, it reaches the upper limit of what the AAP would recommend, drinking. So I think most kids are going to, need a vitamin D supplement in some form, whether it's just a single nutrient supplement or, however you're getting it. And then the other one, there's a couple other that have been kind of interesting. I think DHA and EPA. I think, I would say I feel very comfortable for a vegan, a woman that's pregnant that's vegan or in the first year of life. We have some data to suggest that DHA and EPA are really critical. And we're seeing, DHA and EPA in our infant formulas now. Beyond a couple of years of age, I think there's a little bit more, do we really need it? I think people aren't sure. And for me, it really comes down to a question of affordability, because I think of all the supplements, it tends to be a little bit more pricey. So I see some variability in terms of DHA and EPA. The other thing I remind people is that there are a lot of omnivorous children that don't eat fish. Fish is one of those things that a lot of kids don't eat enough of. So if what I usually say is if you're not consuming, a couple servings of fish a day, you could consider getting a DHA and EPA supplement if it fits within your budget. You could also consume, a higher quantity of ALA rich foods. And ALA can be converted to EPA and DHA, but the conversion can be very variable and it's not very efficient. But so it's like walnuts and chia seeds and hemp seeds and flax seeds. So that's a little bit iffy. And then the nutrient that I think over the last few years, I've sort of learned more about and been paying more attention to is iodine.
Oh, I was hoping you would say that because I wrote it down. I'm like, question mark, is she going to mention iodine?
And the reason for that is actually, I thought one of the things that's so interesting, especially when we were writing our book, we did a lot of this research and especially creating these courses. And one of the things that I found to be really interesting is this perception of vegan and vegetarian diets being so deficient in critical nutrients. And one of the things that I think we forget is our food systems are fortified to help us meet the RDA for critical nutrients. And so, for instance, we add B vitamins to our grains and we add, cow's milk is fortified with vitamin D because we recognize it's a nutrient that's difficult to get. And we have fortification in iodized salt. That's one of the easiest ways to get iodine in the diet, other than shellfish and seafood and, dairy to some degree. But it's fortified. But I think as the trend towards fancier foods and, people are using pink Himalayan salt and all these like fancy salts, they're really great culinary in terms of your culinary preparations, but they're typically not fortified with iodine. So if you're a vegan family that does not use iodized salt, you need to make sure that you're getting iodine from a consistent source. And it can be in the form of a multivitamin. I know for younger children, they have like iodine drops. But if you're okay using iodized salt, that's probably the easiest way. One other way that you can sort of get iodine in the diet is through seaweeds. They're usually very rich in iodine. I'm a little cautious of that in kids because the amount of iodine can be very variable. I sort of describe iodine as this sort of Goldilocks nutrient. You have to get the just right amount. A little bit, you don't want to be under, but if you go over, that can be a problem too. And so you have to be careful if you're going to rely on some of the seaweeds and kelps and things like that, because very easily you can go over the upper threshold of iodine. That's safe.
Yeah. Listeners might be surprised to know also that, ultra processed foods, which are oftentimes higher in sodium, those manufacturers aren't using iodized salt. Right. And so you can't make that connection and assume it's going to be a good source of iodine either. So I'm too fascinated with iodine. I think it's, as somebody who's well over 50, even for women over 50, it becomes more of a nutrient of concern. Again, we're not eating, we're told not to eat a lot of salt. The salt we're eating is kosher salt or pink Himalayan or sea salt, none of which are iodized. And, women, our metabolism is changing and, there are growing cases, I guess, of thyroid problems and all of this, it's all interlinked. And so it is a nutrient that I think we're going to continue to hear more about as for all of us, for all age groups.
Yeah.
When you think about the teenager in terms of the teen who's considering or practicing plant-based eating, what do you see as the pitfalls or the common pitfalls that teenagers are engaged in? Some of maybe their mistakes or their misnomers, their missteps around implementing a plant-based diet, successfully.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this really intersects with just adolescents in general. I think they're going for the quick foods. They're going for the foods that they're eating with their friends. They're eating, and I think the balance can be thrown off. And one of the things that I found can be most helpful is actually really the basic practice of family meals. And I think like we still want our teenagers at our dinner tables, because I think that's where we're sort of able to check in on whether they're getting balanced meals and things like that. And as a parent, my sort of approach has always been to really offer as much warmth and support as I can without completely taking over and doing it for them. And so finding ways, again, going back to the issues of like, I find that if most teenagers are meeting their calorie requirements, they're making sure that they're getting adequate protein and they're checking their boxes off on those few critical nutrients, they're going to be in pretty good shape. And so having ideas ahead of time that can be quick and easy for them, that can be grab and go, so that you're setting them up for success. I also think that if you have a situation where it's the teenager that wants to have a vegetarian or vegan diet and the rest of the family is really, not participating, I think it's okay to have them have a little bit more responsibility around coming up with either a plan or even some of the workload around incorporating those foods, into the regular family mix. And I think it can be a lot for parents to feel like they have to do multiple meals, like, oh, this is my vegetarian child, this is my picky child, this is my this child. And so, coming up with strategies that can kind of simplify things at the family level.
Yeah, I think that's great. One of the questions I had for you today was thinking about the signs of a quote unquote healthy plant-based following teen or a healthy teen vegetarian versus a teen who might be throwing up red flags in terms of how they're approaching this sort of dietary or eating pattern. So let's start with sort of the quote unquote, the healthy teen vegetarian. What does that teenager look like? What are they doing on a day-to-day basis that makes you feel like this kid's on the right track and, they're doing well?
Yeah. So for me, it would be that they're eating a variety of foods, that they are paying attention to those, calorie and protein requirements, and that there is, it's kind of like a lot of people give, they sort of look disapprovingly at the My Plate model. But really, if you look at the My Plate model, I would say it's a predominantly plant-based plate, right? 70 fruits, vegetables, whole grains, at least 75% is plant-based. And then the quarter protein category could, we're all encouraging people to eat more plant-based versus a protein. So to me, a green flag would be, does their plate look good? Does it look balanced? Does it have some fiber and some protein and some healthy fats? Does it seem something that like the teen is actually going to enjoy? Because I think for me, one of the things I'm really looking for is an enjoyment and an excitement around food. So that to me is part of a balanced plate. I think I'm looking for balanced meals, I'm looking for balanced snacks, and I'm looking for variety.
Awesome. And no signs of restriction or anything like that, which we'll get into. Those could be the red flags, right? So
for me, the green flags are those things: balance, variety, enjoyment, and, sort of an awareness of some of the key nutrients that they have to pay attention to.
Got it. What would be the red flags for you?
So the red flags for me would be that it's really focused on cutting out foods. I've seen, situations where it's not just a vegan or vegetarian diet, but it's a vegan or vegetarian diet. And I'm also not going to do gluten, and I'm also not going to do added oils. And I'm also really paying attention to added sugars, and it just becomes more and more and more restrictive. I think a lot of this is going to depend on the teen's motivations and why they're coming to you. So for instance, if a teen is coming to me saying, I can't tolerate eating animals, there's so much animal suffering, I really care about climate change. One of the things I have is like the cupcake test. All right, I've got a cupcake. If it's delicious, but it's vegan, it's a vegan cupcake, are you going to eat that? And for the teen that says, if it's vegan, bring it on. I'm eating that cupcake. It looks so good. Versus like, oh, no, that to me, it would be a red flag. Like, even if I can sort of address the vegan issues of not using animal foods and stuff, if there's still restriction and anxiety beyond that, that to me is a red flag. And as a pediatrician, I mean, I think one of the biggest red flags is just the growth chart. So if I've seen a dramatic change in the growth chart, I think it's, worth talking about. For adolescent girls, if there's been, any disruption in the menstrual cycle, that can also be a red flag. And I think the other thing for adolescents is I think it's not just what's happening at the dinner table or in their lunchbox, but it's also like, what are their friendships like? Are they having symptoms of depression or anxiety? Because all of those things can indicate a deeper underlying problem. But if you have a well-adjusted kid that's eating a balance of nutrients, is not having any, concerning drops in their weight, I'm less worried about that kid.
Yeah, me too. I agree with you 100% on all of that. I'm thinking about, the athletes. Are there any additional sort of red flags that might pop up for an athlete? Because I tend to see a lot of athletes that are also, plant forward or wanting to be vegan. As a pediatrician, does that cause, are your sort of alert buttons on high? Are you on high alert with that type of teenager? And if so, sort of what are you looking for again? And how are you addressing it with the teen or the teen's parent?
Yeah. And I think if you have an athlete that's performing sort of at a much higher level, I actually think that it could be really helpful to work with a dietitian to make sure that they're meeting those. And it comes down to energy and protein. If they're meeting their energy and protein requirements, that's a very, very good first start for any athlete, regardless of if they're, vegan, vegetarian, or omnivorous. And for female athletes, I mean, I think that the period is a must have. Like if you're losing your period because of your sport or because of your nutrition, that's an enormous red flag that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. We now have REDS, which I'm sure, 10 years ago, I mean, we had it, we didn't call it REDS, but I noticed just, I don't want to call it cavalier, but sort of a cavalier attitude about women and their periods, teenagers and their periods. They don't see it as a bad thing to lose. They see it as, well, maybe they don't put as much weight on the period as a pediatrician and a dietitian would. I'm always saying to the parents, that's the hallmark of female health. If you don't have your period, it's a big concern, right? But I do notice that teenagers, particularly, athletes, which I tend to, I see more athlete teenagers probably than any other thing. They don't seem to be too bothered by losing their period.
Yeah, I haven't noticed that too much. I think that the way I explain it is it's a sort of a marker that your physiology is working, that you're making the hormones that you need and your physiology is working normally. And that the absence of your period is actually a marker of other serious problems like maintaining bone health and all these things that, sometimes for teenagers, it's a variety of things. They don't have that sort of long-term thinking. They're not going to think about how smoking or drugs or alcohol is going to affect their long-term health. And I think the same is true about nutrition and understanding that if you're not having your period consistently, obviously short of some other underlying medical issue, that's a sign that something's, off and needs to be addressed.
Yeah. What are your thoughts around children who have, or teenagers who have larger bodies? Are there concerns around, going plant forward or plant-based for them?
So the studies that have been done on height, weight, BMI for children following plant-based diets typically show that they tend to be a little bit on the leaner side compared to, so I think higher body weights are seen less often in vegan and vegetarian children, which doesn't mean that that's not going to be the case for some people. But I think in general, if people are moving towards a more healthful plant-based diet that includes, lots of fiber and fruits and vegetables, if you have a child that's living in a higher size body, it can sometimes help, to bring them back to a weight that might be more in line with where their growth chart should be.
Yeah. So when I wrote Kids Thrive at Every Size, and I looked sort of through the approved dietary approaches for not managing weight, but managing health in children of smaller bodies and larger bodies, the proven diets were the DASH diet for managing high blood pressure, the Mediterranean diet for, again, managing overall health and, health concerns, and vegetarianism.
Yeah.
Those were the three main diets.
And I think one of the things that I suspect you and I are very much in alignment about this is I don't think that there's a special diet for a child that's in a larger body. I think it's, it's really a family system approach of how you're going to feed the diet, feed your family for overall long-term health. And so I don't really think there's a special diet for a kid in a larger body versus a smaller body. In fact, one of the things that I think pediatricians often get wrong, and I've often gotten wrong early in my career, is you look at the growth chart as a marker of the quality of their nutrition and their overall dietary pattern. That if a child falls within the confines of what we call a normal BMI, you actually don't even really need to talk about nutrition because the growth chart says that they're doing fine. Mm-hmm. Not the case. I've had plenty of children who are 50th percentile for everything on their growth charts. And if you actually talk to the family about what the child is eating, it's not a very health promoting diet. So I think the BMI is a tool that's best used, I found in practice, for tracking the growth of that child, the BMI, height, weight. And all children, all families deserve the same conversation about health promoting diets, regardless of where they fall on the growth chart. The other thing I will say is that oftentimes families and kids have come, to me talking about weight concerns. And I think they really deserve an honest conversation. And if they're looking for tools, if they're looking for strategies, I always try to focus them at the family level, not anything that's being done specifically for that child, but as a family, what can you do to improve the overall nutritional quality of your diet for a family as a whole, as opposed to singling out that child?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing more and more clients and families in my private practice. And oftentimes, they are coming into the conversation with, I need to have a special plan for this child. And I'm always saying, oh, no, this is a whole family approach. Everybody's doing the same thing. Everybody's eating the same foods. Everybody's moving the same way. Everybody's focused on getting good sleep. All of the habits.
Are you sometimes surprised? I think one of the things I found really surprising in my practice and having worked with families is how often the parents are wanting a solution for their child's diet. When you look at the parent's diet, it's like, but you're not eating fruits and vegetables. How do you expect your child to eat fruits and vegetables? So I think it really has to be a family-based approach. And I've seen situations where it's an incredible burden to be putting on an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old. It's like, it is still fundamentally our job as parents to provide them with a foundation of nutritious foods that can support their growth, their development, and, the areas in which they want to thrive. It is not up to the child to be making these decisions and to be making these adjustments. So I feel very strongly about that because I think
I do too. And I do feel like you're so careful with your language. I mean, for as long as I've known you, you're very careful with how you present your ideas and you're sensitive about the language that you use. And that's something that, as for the healthcare providers, the pediatricians, the dietitians out there listening, I think we can all use that sort of sensitivity around language, whether we are talking about children with larger bodies, children with smaller bodies, children who want to be vegan or vegetarian, children who want to be omnivore. It's just how we talk about all of these things has a lot of power and weight on how kids feel about themselves and how they feel about
and to be perfectly honest,
their health.
Is an area of growth for me because I think my awareness around language, I'm still learning and I still sometimes say the wrong thing. And to me, I used to be so focused on wanting to get the language right all the time. And what I realized is the most important thing is to just have enough awareness and enough humility that when there is a shift in language that's called for, be very quick to hear it and to adopt it. And so I'm glad that you brought that up because it is something that's really important to me. And if I misspeak or say something that could be said more carefully, I always want someone to share that with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Me too. I mean, I feel like it's been a long learning curve for me as well. So given that, how might you talk to a teen about pursuing plant forward or plant-based diet? And in that context, if you are concerned about them and their eating patterns and their health as a result of that, how might you sort of talk about that? And that's something I think that parents listening will benefit from, but also healthcare providers, just to model how you might approach that topic.
And, it's interesting because there was a study, there have been a couple of studies, I think mostly out of Europe, that have looked at parent perceptions of how confident they were that their pediatrician could guide them and support them in their vegetarian vegan. And parents had low level of confidence that their pediatrician could actually support them. As a pediatrician and as a parent, lead with curiosity. I think it's really important to understand the perspective of the kid in front of you and let that curiosity guide your conversation. And the more curious you are, the more they're going to share about their motivations, about what they're waiting, hoping to accomplish. So the first step is curiosity. And then I think the next step is how much collaboration how much of a partnership can you create between the parent and the child? Because I think then they're working together as opposed to working against one another. And that collaboration could look like coming up with meal ideas, or if the family is not vegetarian, like, all right, well, what would be some good options for swapping out the protein? We're having chicken stir fry. We'll do tofu for you, and really using a collaborative approach. And I think if there is a lot of resistance anywhere in that dynamic, I think getting a dietitian involved can be really, really helpful to help. I don't really like the idea of tracking or any of that stuff. But I think if there's a lot of concern, I think tracking for a few days to get an overall idea of where you're meeting your nutrient intakes can be helpful. With teenagers, I would be really careful not to have them do that on their own because it can turn into sort of like an obsessive sort of thing. So you want to be cautious how you do that. So working with a dietitian can be really helpful. I also think if I'm dealing with a teenager and their parents are kind of a little unsure, I really encourage them to take on some responsibility. Why don't you, if you're going to do a meatless Monday, you take it on for your family and use this as an opportunity to introduce your family to a lot of these foods. One of the things that I've been surprised about, I've not been vegan for my whole life. It's been sort of later in life, I think, gradually and then fully vegan for the last 10 years. I've been amazed at how delicious the food is and how just satisfying it is. And so I really like to see if families can embrace that aspect of it. Have some try different, so many different ethnic foods, like Ethiopian food or Indian food or Thai food. It's just, there's so many plant-based options. And so if you can lead with curiosity, invite collaboration, and then let it be fun.
Yeah, I love that. That's so, so great. Anything else before we close up here and wrap up? Anything else you want parents to know about having a teen who's vegetarian, interacting with them? I think you really wrapped it up there at the end quite well, but I want to give you the opportunity if there's anything else you want to sort of touch on before we sign off.
Yeah, I think one last thing I would say is, especially if you're in a situation where your teenager is coming to you wanting to explore a vegetarian diet, wanting to explore a vegan diet, I think that as our kids get older, we get so focused on trying them to guide them in this direction, or they should be doing that, and they have to join this club, or they have to do their homework. And we sort of sometimes forget about the wonder of it all. And so, one thing that comes to mind is if you had a child that was really interested in dinosaurs, as a parent, you'd be buying dinosaur books or pointing things out or going to maybe a natural history museum. You would meet their curiosity with your own enthusiasm and curiosity. And I think that a child wanting to be vegetarian, be vegan, move more plant-based, it can be a really beautiful thing. You think about the core tenets. It's about climate change. It's about compassion towards animals. It's about wanting to have a healthy lifestyle. These are all things that can be celebrated. Certainly, parents need to act if they have concern about this being sort of restrictive or falling in line with an eating disorder. And we need to act promptly and appropriately in that situation. But for the most part, I think it can be an invitation to a really beautiful conversation for the whole family.
Yeah, I love that. Reshma, where can people find you, connect with you if they want to have a deeper conversation about this?
So I've got a website that just has some resources and recipes on plant-based nutrition. It's reshmashahmd.com. And then more recently, I've actually started offering parent coaching services. So I used to be an affiliate clinical instructor at Stanford, but I'm no longer seeing patients in a clinical setting. But I missed working with families. And so I'm offering parent coaching services. So if you want to, work on some of these conversations, it's Reshma Shah MD Parent Coaching. Very clever, I know. And then I'm also on Instagram at Reshma Shah. So those are probably the easiest ways to get in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to share your expertise and your experiences. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jill.
Folks, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Shah. She's fabulous, knows a whole lot about kids and their health, teens and health, as well as following plant-based, vegan, vegetarian practices. So check her out. Be sure to go to her website and check out her offerings at reshmashahmd.com. And I'll link all of those up in the show notes. That's it for this week, folks. I hope you're having a great one. Be sure to tune in a couple of weeks. We will have some David Grotto on the show talking about his new book and talking about food marketing to children. It'll be a great episode. But for now, make sure you give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.